You talk a little bit about fiscal flexibility toward the end of the piece, using something called a fiscal switch. So I'm going to ask a question, but I do want you to explore that a little bit, what you mean by fiscal flexibility. But my question has more to do with the turning point, or if there is a turning point between uh, basically not caring or caring a lot less about short-term deficits as we try to get the economy growing again, get through the pandemic, to focusing on long-term fiscal policy where we do have concern about growing deficits and a massive debt. So, and you've got things like MMT cropping up, where basically they're saying there isn't a turning point, and if there is, it's way down the line. So the question is there a turning point? How do you measure it? And I'm wondering if that comes into play with your comments on fiscal flexibility in the piece.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think that if you, a lot of the MMTers will say we can deficit spend in perpetuity until there's inflation, and then when there's inflation, we raise taxes, or we deal with it then when inflation happens. In principle, all else being equal, that framework might make sense because if there's no, if the government can borrow at a low interest rate and there's no inflation, maybe you can get away with that for some time. The problem is all else isn't equal. We have these giant structural deficits that are growing in the future because of the aging of our population. Our long-term tax and spending policies are not aligned, and it's going to grow even worse with the aging of the population because largest programs in the federal budget, like Social Security and Medicare, are growing significantly faster than the revenues needed to finance them. And so if we just take this MMT approach of we're not going to worry about this until inflation happens, and then we hit inflation, what then? If in 2030 we have significant inflation and rising interest costs, we've racked up more debt, we have made more promises on Social Security and Medicare to more people who are now retired, and that puts future policymakers in a no-win situation where they either have to suddenly cut benefits on people who've planned their lives around them, or they need to do it all on the tax side, which is going to fall exclusively on young workers while having asked nothing of the people of the generations who went up to that point without making their contributions to make those programs sustainable. Or they're going to do nothing and you're going to have inflation just continue. And so the problem with MMT is it ignores the structural impediments that would prevent Congress from swiftly moving once inflation takes place.
I think it might be difficult for Congress to raise taxes quickly.
Is that a rhetorical question, Bob?
I mean, yeah, I know it was a rhetorical question, but I think that's an important element there. That number one, it would be incredibly politically difficult to do it to enact major deficit reduction policy on a dime like that. But I think even if Congress could just snap their fingers and implement these policies, they would be bad. It would be bad policy outcomes to just suddenly do a massive tax increase just on young workers, or to suddenly cut Social Security benefits for people who have already retired and planned their lives around them. I think whether Congress acts quickly or not, that it's a no-win situation to be in. And so if we're going to try to push the envelope on seeing how much we can get away with stimulating the economy in the short term, and I think we should push the envelope on that, it would be much safer to do so if we didn't have to worry about the structural debt deficit in the background when inflation happens.
One thing that you had talked about before was kind of flooding the zone. That is to say that it's given the current situation, it would be better to overdo it in terms of fiscal policy than underdo it, which is something that the chairman of the Federal Reserve has also commented on. So you're in good company there. The couple of questions that come up from that is, what is the extent of overdoing it? I mean, where do you draw the line? Is there a line on overdoing it? And that gets into a question also about targeting. I thought that the last jobs report, the December jobs report, really illustrated how how targeted this jobs loss is in certain industries, leisure, hospitality, that have been mostly affected by the pandemic. So you really have this split. Some call it a K-shaped recovery. There are different definitions of that, but one clearly shows that, a lot of job sectors continue to increase steadily, but slowly but steadily, while others are plummeting. And if you look at what you might want to do on the fiscal side to address that, does it make sense, say, to give $2,000 checks to everybody, blanketing the economy with it, where you clearly have just certain segments that are in the most dire need?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Gonna sort of answer that a little bit backwards, starting with the point about the $2,000 checks. One stat that really jumped out to me was looking at the cost of the $2,000 checks versus something like unemployment insurance. So the issue I have with the $2,000 checks is if you have the same income you did before the pandemic, you have your job, you're going along just fine, you do not need a $2,000 check. That is a lot of money to just kind of hand out for no reason. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, if you have lost your job and you're trying to pay rent and put food on your table, $2,000 is not enough. It's not even close to enough. And so I think we really do want to target that money. And the thing that jumped out to me is expanded unemployment insurance, which really does target people who have lost their jobs. For the same cost, or roughly the same cost as one $2,000 check, we could extend the expanded unemployment insurance that right now expires in March. We could extend that for the rest of the year. We could expand, for the cost of the checks, we could expand the child tax credit for 10 years. The earned income tax credit, we could expand that one. Like, there are so many better uses of that money that are more targeted. And we're not saying don't spend that money. We're saying try to spend it on the right things. The corollary to that is, as you said, we'd rather overdo it than underdo it. At the same time, I think it's also a question of how much. So all else being equal, it would be better to overdo it by 10% than underdo it by 10%. There's not really a question in my mind about that. But if you're asking, is it better to overdo it by 200% or underdo it by 2%, I think that becomes a little more difficult to justify. And I do have some concern that we might be going more towards that latter circumstance if some people in my party get their way.
Well, I do think it's, I agree. And I think that overdoing it on if you're going to overdo it on the side of people and industries that really are affected by the pandemic. This is, not the usual recession, as we've been saying since the beginning. It's highly specialized recession in some ways, which makes it easier to respond to if you keep it more targeted. And if we're going to overdo it on areas that we clearly know need. And I take your point completely about unemployment benefits. We've seen in the past unemployment benefits, state aid to keep people from being laid off those are important factors in keeping the economy going.
Okay, so something else we touched on in the last segment with you, Ben, and was intended to be the focus of this segment, but we've had some great conversation so far, is the topic of reconciliation, or the reconciliation process. And Ben was asked about the potentially large agenda going through the Senate on the coattails of this process, which could basically help sidestep filibuster and the 60-vote majority needed to pass certain legislation. Ben actually said he didn't think the filibuster was going to go anywhere, and that reconciliation was at times appropriate to use. So actually, my question is for you, Tori. Do you agree with Ben, or do you have a different take?
I mean, I guess it depends on how much Republicans in the Senate are willing to cooperate. And that remains to be seen. I think you'll see some fingerprints when it comes to negotiating committee ratios, committee budgets, and other rules that will govern the Senate. If there are signals of cooperation, it would be, I think, my preference, but also members of Congress' preference to pass legislation via the regular process. And the reason why is because bipartisan legislation is always the most durable legislation. When you try and pass legislation via reconciliation, the dirty little secret is that reconciliation in general produces crappy law. The rules and the restrictions that govern the contents of reconciliation really make it hard to create new law. It's really good at changing and making adjustments to existing law, but it's really hard to stand up new legislation just because of all of the restrictions. And plus, you've got the Byrd rule that I think Ben mentioned in the last segment. Byrd rule basically says that once you hit the end of that 10-year window, everything going forward cannot add to the deficit on a net basis. And what that ends up happening is that any kind of policies inside the window, the budget window, that raise spending and create deficits, or reduce revenues and create more deficits in the out years, you have to turn them off. Okay, we saw that in the 2017 tax bill. All the corporate and international tax provisions, those were made permanent, but all the provisions affecting small business and individuals, those expire in 2025. And that just makes it impossible to plan. And it also makes really crappy tax policy. So I think, there's sort of it's a double-edged sword when it comes to reconciliation. It definitely helps you pass legislation more quickly, because it allows the Senate to act a little bit more like the House in terms of majority rules. But because of that, there are certain restrictions about what you can put into a reconciliation bill, and those restrictions can be really problematic in standing up good legislation. And I think you even saw that with Obamacare.
I think the Obamacare example is actually incredibly instructive, because what happened was a lot of people think that Obamacare passed via reconciliation, and that's only part of the story.
Right.
The Affordable Care Act first passed the Senate and the House as traditional legislation. It was traditional legislation. It passed the 60-vote majority. And then when Democrats lost the Senate and they wanted to make changes to that bill, they made those changes through reconciliation. But the underlying
sidecar,
had to be passed through the normal process. And so realizing that even the Affordable Care Act couldn't have passed just through reconciliation.